All right, welcome to week 10. It's been a long and hopefully helpful journey, and we got a few more weeks to go. But look forward to tonight's discussion in particular, because I think it really is helpful to what we're trying to accomplish as a class and kick in some creative imagination. So we're working towards the end again in this course, and I have been lenient on papers, but I can't be lenient for the final paper. So basically, if you've turned your papers in on time, they've been good, and you got an A. If you turn it in late, I gave you a B, but all the papers have been acceptable, and I've enjoyed what you've done. But I can't allow incompletes. The school is really asking me, and listen, I have incompletes from last year in this class. And it's just hard for graduate students. You need to know this. If you don't get the work done, you might not get it done, and I don't want you to lose this. So I don't know that I'm speaking to any of you in this present class, but I may be talking to some people online that have a tendency to procrastinate. You don't want to do that. So please work to get your work done. If you hand it in late, the best you can do is a C, and you might not do that well. I mean, that's your course grade, because your whole course grade is dependent on your book reviews. You'll turn those in. That's no big deal. But it's on your final paper. And your first two parts of that you've already done. So you want to make sure and get your paper turned in on time. Was that mean enough? Did you get it? Okay, we got it. All right. And ideally, what I'd like to do is I'd like to schedule some individual time with each one of you concerning your project. And I'd like to do that before you do your final writing of it. So those of you who are physically present, we can just talk about a time. And I don't anticipate it being more than 15, 20, maybe an hour, 15 or 20 minutes or an hour. But those of you who are online, if you'll call, I'd be more than glad to do it with a phone interview. I'd just like to talk to you about what you're thinking, what you're doing, and I'd rather discuss that with you personally than do it by email. I find that really annoying when I'm trying to write it. And even in the way that I grade papers, I'll get a comment back to you on your final paper for sure, but I'd much rather talk to you personally about it than so what I'm asking you to do is to talk to me between now and April 15th about your project. And so we'll talk about how to schedule that. But if you have a pretty good idea of already what you want to do, I don't have a lot of availability this week, but I will starting next week. And remember your 4 book reviews. You have the 3 class texts. And by the way, someone asked me, how long does a book review need to be? As long as you need it to be. I'd like you to develop the habit of reviewing any book that you read for your own sake. What I try to do when I write a book, I try to briefly outline the content of it. And in particular, anything that I found particularly profound, I'll add that in that document. I'm not worried about formal book review form. Basically, if you do a paragraph, now obviously the required books, we know what's in them, but just give a brief paragraph describing their content, and then give me a reaction, your reaction to that content. So, if that's a page, fine. If it's 2 pages, fine. Don't do anything extensive. I'm just asking you to consider developing the discipline of reviewing any book that you read. So I would hope this would be helpful to you. Remember that you have a supplemental text. That means a text other than what is required in the class that has something to do with missional strategy. And I'm giving you, I'd really like it to be one of the books that you read for your final paper. So you can be redundant there. Just make sure and get that done and review that. And what I do with that, if I get them in on time, I'll send out a Word file, a doc file, or a PDF file with all the various reviews of the other books that you've read, and make that available to all the class. So there's 25 people taking this course, and that'll be 25 books read that may give you some insight into a book you might want to read next. Any questions on this?
That also be the 25th?
Yeah. We good?
So can I ask you, so what would the average length of a book review be?
Well, if you double space, it'd be 2 pages, because it's basically a content paragraph and a reaction paragraph. Okay? And I know, I have students cut and paste out of Amazon all the time, and if you want to cheat, God will get you. I might not, but cheating on a graduate degree in Bible is to be frowned upon by all. We have some professors that are so diligent they actually do Google searches to find out if you cheated. I don't care about you that much. I didn't get near the response out of that I wanted, but it'll work. All right, what I want us to talk about tonight, this has been a very reflective week for me for a lot of different reasons. Every 5 years, and it looks, my wife has negotiated with me that it looks like it's going to go to every 3 years now because she's saying I don't have a lot of time left, apparently. But the kids are growing up. But we took all 13 of our clan, which is our 3 children, their spouses, and our 5 grandchildren, and we spent a week at Fort Wilderness in Disney World, and which is a very nostalgic thing for our family. When our kids were little, we had a pop-up camper and a van. I'm really glad those days are over. It was just a part of Rebecca, my wife's DNA. She'd grown up camping, not me. But I enjoyed it, and we'd go down to Fort Wilderness, which is a campground at Disney World, and basically, we had just enough money to get to the parks one day. But we bought a 5-year pass, so for 5 years we could go, and we'd go to park one day. But it was just the experience, and that was such an important part of their upbringing that they wanted to do it. We hadn't done it for 7 or 8 years. And so, some of you follow me on Twitter, and you know that I tweeted out a couple of things, one of which was, I get it. I get the magic of the Magic Kingdom. And I don't know that I've gotten it as well because I watched it through the eyes of my grandkids, which was really, really fun. There's nothing quite like watching your 5-year-old grandson experience the Tower of Terror. I mean, I have a whole new definition for a look of terror on a little kid's face, to which, by the way, his parents said we've now lost our Parenting of the Year badges, and probably so. But it was just absolute terror. But he was going to prove that he could do it. It was important for him, a rite of passage or something. But my favorite event, as I look back over the week, there are a lot of little things that I enjoyed. But we did the character breakfast on Monday. You know what that is? That's where you go to Mickey's Chef, and you go, and it's a really good buffet. I mean, I don't regret that. But then the Fabulous Six. Does anyone know who the Fabulous Six are? Can you name them? Minnie, Donald, Pluto, Daffy? Daffy? Man, don't go into it. That's Warner Brothers. You're out of here. I'm really Daisy and Donald and Goofy. Good, thank you. I now, by the way, if you come into my office, I have those 6 figurines all over my office. You have to find them. That's the adventure of my grandkids. But I found out that my fellow professors are really intrigued by that, so they come in and look around. They need something to do. But the characters come by the tables, and what was funny is my 15-month-old grandson had been prepped by his parents for like a year for this event. And watching him respond, this little kid, who can't quite, he chatters a lot, but he doesn't talk yet. And he's like, he's meeting old friends. And he's thrilled to meet them. And then my older grandkids are getting their autographs. Pluto has an awesome autograph. I was thinking about all this, and what basically Disney has done is Walt Disney built a dynasty around a mouse. And he's created an experience that I thought really fit well into Van Hooser's. I was reading this again as I was experiencing this and going, wow, this is really interesting. If you know the story of Walt Disney, he starts out of poverty pretty much and builds this amazing empire that started on the drawing of a mouse that he was able to copyright, and then the other characters followed. But what he's done is he's created an experience, and on our way home Friday, Rebecca was looking up for me different quotes from Disney, and his philosophy of life is really interesting, where basically he's trying to create an experience of joy for the entire family that will give them a sense that they participated in something that has called them out of sort of the brokenness of the world and let them just experience joy for a while before they have to plug back into the real world. And what I was thinking about was, if Disney can build a dynasty around a mouse, if Jesus is truly the Christ, what might we do around that idea? Now, of course, that takes some unpacking, and I know this is different. Don't hear this as being an appeal to entertainment. But I do think, and I'm challenging my students with this every day, my undergraduate students, and I'll talk to you more about that today. I'm not just talking about mimicking. I don't want to create, by the way, there is such a thing as Bible land. That's a really bad idea in my mind. They have a Jesus character walking around. I've seen him interviewed. If that's Jesus, I don't really want to follow him. He's a weird dude. And I don't know what he's smoking, but I don't think it's the Holy Spirit. Anyway, if you know what I'm talking about, I'm not.
People thought Jesus was a weird dude, though. Liar and lunatic. Yeah, that's what people think.
Well, I mean, but I think the people that were with him, from what I read in the Scriptures, they really wanted to be around him. I mean, of course, he offended the Pharisees because he was ruining their world. But people really wanted to be around him. There was something compelling about it. And I do think sometimes we have these images of Jesus that aren't very helpful. But somehow, here we talk about the difficulty of communicating Christ. This is the purpose of the class. We're talking about how do you introduce Jesus to non-believers. And you start thinking about that, and that's why I really like Van Hooser's approach. He's saying, here's this amazing drama that we believe to be the true story. Those of us who are followers of Jesus as the Christ, that idea of the Christ means he is life, there is no other possibility of life like in Christ. He is the anointed one of the Creator to show us how to live. And so, where have we as a church so misrepresented Jesus as a compelling way of life rather than sort of a restrictive? Again, we've talked about this all semester, but the idea of having an institution that gets us to heaven when we die, I think misses the entire adventure into which we are invited. In my experience over the last few years, I'm more deeply convinced than I've ever been, including an experience I'll share with you tonight, that when the adventure of the kingdom of God is presented as a transformative experience of significant change that changes an individual from being a spectator to a participant. And one of the things that I noticed, and you all know this if you've been to any kind of what do we call it, theme parks, whatever. Of course, Disney does it better than everybody. I'm convinced, because they their recipe is you're here to make life better for everyone who attends. I mean, all of their employees are amazingly well trained to create this kind of experience. So, in a sense, what I saw was what I think Van Hooser's talking about in terms of here are actors performing on a stage, inviting you to participate in a reality that, okay, you really know is not true, but they do it so well that you enjoy it for a while. So here we are talking about belief in a Creator who invites us into his redemptive drama, and we have an actual part to play. And this is who we are. This is not, it's the essence of who we are. And we'll talk about that. There's some things that Van Hooser brings up that I think are really compelling in terms of what does it mean to be the image of God? What does it mean to live in the triune nature of God? And I know some of that's hard to unpack, but I want us to work through that. Because I think too many of us have been afraid of the idea of the Trinity instead of recognizing that it may be the key to inviting the world to participate in something that they have not yet seen in us. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the power of the ordered life. How many of you were at the luncheon with John Ortberg? Okay, he did this presentation I found really compelling, and it's made me want to go back and read. I read his book, Soul Keeping. I wasn't paying enough attention when I read it. I don't remember. I was distracted. But it wasn't one of my favorite Ortberg books. But I want to go back and read it now, because basically he extrapolated the information out of that book and made a presentation at lunch on Tuesday. And I listened to all of his presentations. I really felt like that was his best one in terms of how it left me thinking. But he talks about this idea that we all have a will, and the second L is dark there. I should have used a different color for the font. But the will is that which is in this is what differentiates us from the animal world in the sense we have a will that God has given us that is the central part of our being. And then he talks about the mind. And the mind is the cognitive process. That the will works through the mind, but the mind, in a sense, is our, it's that which processes our understanding of life. So you know that sometimes that you can make your mind up on something, but your will trump your mind. In that you're thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. Why am I doing it? So we find ourselves struggling there. And then he talks about the body, which is this really strong identity. It's the tent that we live in, but it has something to do with who we are. And the body will often trump the will. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of looking down and seeing in your hand a Snickers bar when you've been on a diet for 2 weeks. And the will is, that's evil and awful and you don't want to eat it. And the body goes, eat it, you idiot. And what do? You eat it. So the body trumps the will. How does that work? And then he talks about social interaction. All of us have this. We have our interaction with others. And so this is what we live with every day. We have the will, the mind, the body, our community interaction, how we interact with the world. And what I found really compelling was, and I've done some further reading on this, and I think he's right, that Ortberg talked about the soul as being that which orders the entirety of our being. That the soul is not a speck inside the will. The soul is the total essence of humankind, and that God has created us in order to order our lives in such a way that we, as Van Hooser, I think, so compellingly points out, that the Trinity has created us to be in relationship with Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And what I found compelling about that presentation was, I know when we'll throw around words like the lost, the unrepentant sinner. We'll title people in ways that are disparaging and not very helpful. But what Ortberg was talking about that I find particularly helpful, he said, look, when we talk about the lost soul, you're just talking about the soul whose life has not been ordered to its created intent. That what God intends to do in Christ Jesus, through the transformative power of the Spirit, is to order the entirety of our being so that we're living in conformity with the reason for which we've been created. So that the soul, the essence of our being, when it's ordered by Jesus, looks much different than the soul that is disordered because it's influenced by the world. Does that make sense at all? Is that helpful? So that what we're trying to do, and this is such a different project. I was reflecting over this week, how many people I've tried to convert to a religion instead of introducing them to the appropriate order of their soul. Meaning I've tried to get them to conform to practices that wouldn't necessarily contribute to this. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm more convinced than ever that the church is absolutely essential to this project. More than I've ever been convinced. It's got to be a community of people whose lives are ordered. But the problem, which Van Hooser points out, and we'll look at it later in our discussion tonight, is we have so many people in the church whose lives are disordered by the world that we have nothing to differentiate ourselves from the world on the stage of life. In other words, we find ourselves on the stage of the world and we all look like the world around us, except we say we have a way of salvation that we ourselves are not even experiencing. Is that too harsh? So how should that affect your understanding of your project? I think this might be helpful in that any kind of missional strategy ought to work toward the ordering of the soul through the power of the Spirit of God. Now, Van Hooser never argues that, nor does Ortberg. This is the work of the Holy Spirit. But we make ourselves available to the work of the Spirit by understanding that here's what we can't do. We cannot will our will to win over our body. That's what Paul says in Romans 7. The more I know what to do, what is right, the more what? I don't do it. But he doesn't end there. He goes to chapter 8 and says, now, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because what I could not do by will, the Lord has done through what Jesus came to do, which is to order my soul through the transformative power of the Spirit of God. And so the ordered soul, what does the mind then contemplate? The mind of Christ, because it's ordered by the transformative power of the Spirit. The body then works in correlation with the mind and the will. The will ultimately is submitted, yielded to the will of Jesus. So His will becomes my will. And then how does that change my social interaction? It changes it dramatically. Because now I'm on mission with God. I see what God sees because my will is working with my mind, is working with my body, and I'm now no longer living for self, which distorts this whole picture. I've released self to the purposes of God. Now, of course, this is not easy. I mean, the idea of self-sacrifice is the hardest concept in the Christian faith, in my view, because the ego is what drives most of our lives. And learning how to allow our lives to be ordered by God is, I think, part of the purpose of the disciplines, which John Ortberg so, I think, powerfully talked about on Monday evening, for those of you who came. I'll have to, for those of you who are taking the course online, I have to apologize. I'd really intended for that to be a part of our lecture 2 weeks ago, and that recording is still not available. I'm not going to mention why or place the blame, but I'm still fighting to get a hold of it. But we will someday have it. We may watch it together on a big screen in heaven, but we will someday have it. But what John Ortberg talked about Monday night, how many of you were there for that? Okay, basically he presented my favorite of his books, which is The Life You've Always Wanted. The idea you cannot now do by trying, but you can ultimately do it through training. That's the transformative work of the Spirit. And so, how then do we do this? Well, we have to first of all be willing to submit our will. And in order to submit our will, we have to be convinced that this is truly salvation. And how do we know that that's salvation if we're not living in the dramatic experience of the kingdom of God? Okay, react to that. Thoughts, questions?
Stiffened behavior modification. This is like reverse engineering here. So like a lot of Christianity is like not to do these certain things and then go backward from that. And this model says like start with like the inside and allow it to like then like trickle down like a waterfall to each thing, so that you might see behavior being the last thing that changes, but with like an actual commitment to change instead of just like surface level.
Well, and you start doing by habit what you previously could not do by will. I mean, that's a hard thing to think of, but I know that I've seen that change in my life in several areas. I still have many areas to go. But in terms of if you habitually walk with Jesus and learn His ways of life, it also becomes your habit. But you're not going to do this with a 1 hour shot on Sunday. See, I think in some ways we have placed pressures on the church and what it's supposed to do for us that God certainly never intended. That the assembly of the church was to be an opportunity to celebrate a life surrendered to Jesus, and that the altar that we worship at is the altar of self-sacrifice, so that becomes an important part of the strategy. But man, it's not the whole show. And understanding that means we've got to change the way that we approach the ordering of our soul. It's not going to be done. I mean, how many times have we done things with our body that we've been ashamed of and tried to will ourselves into different behavior and found ourselves incapable of doing it? It's because we're not. Our soul is ordered towards self-glory rather than God's glory, and we find ourselves all out of order trying to figure this out. Okay, now I know it doesn't have to be this complex, right? I mean, you know people like I do. I know 2 or 3 people I can tell you now who are illiterate, who understand this. Their lives are fully submitted to the will of God, and they understand the ways of Jesus, and they live the ways of Jesus in amazing ways that I sometimes envy their simplicity of life. So I'm not saying that this is this complex structure that you've got to figure out, but I do think this is the way it functions, and that might be helpful. Any other thoughts from... Oh, go ahead.
certainly agree with what you said and what Ortberg said about how ordering your life. I think that I have a little trouble with it looks like a cross section of the earth, the core. No, I don't really see the difference between the will and the mind. I think the will is an aspect of the mind, and of course, we're trying to diagram things that exist only in, you can't touch them. And so, I mean, I don't want to just be arguing for the sake of it, but I think it's like we look at passages like, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. What is the spirit? Is the spirit the will? It seems to me that it's all under the control of the mind. When our body wants something that is, has sexual desire, is that a product of the body or a product of the mind? It's a product of the whole organism. And so I guess that I'm responding more to the breakdown than I am anything else, because there's no question but that it's a matter of the submission of the whole organism to Christ.
Yeah.
And therein is the problem. And where does this Holy Spirit, when it acts upon us and when it gives us the ability, there's no question in my mind that it does, to submit ourselves, how does that work? I don't know.
Well, and that's where I think the disciplines really come into play. And I think you're right in terms of, we can dichotomize this in different ways and divide it in different ways. I do think when he says the spirit is willing, but the body, the flesh is weak, I think there's more to that text than him just scolding the disciples for wanting to sleep. I think he was talking about his own struggle with doing the will of God. Because there his will was to do the will of God, but his body was saying no, 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 no. And he was fighting. And I know there are times in my life when my will is, I want to do this, but my body wins. And you could say that's all a process of the mind, and I understand that. But somehow there is this, I had a student one time, he said, it's sort of like this. Have you ever put on a left-handed glove on your right hand? And, your thumb is in the small finger hole, and all of a sudden, the soul, the purpose is restrained by the covering. He said that's what the body is when the body doesn't fit over the will, that it restricts it and keeps it from being what it's intended to be. And so somehow there is this fight between the flesh and the will, and how does all that work? Well, however you look at that, the ordering of the soul is a transformative work of the Spirit. And what I'm finding in my life, and I think some of you, and Steve, I've journeyed with you enough to know that you're experiencing this as well, as you better understand this, you start finding this existence, which was once such a struggle, it starts, pieces start fitting again. And, this is building out of the idea when what is the Shema? The Lord our God is one. And so what is our response to that? We are to love the Lord with heart, soul, strength, and mind. Well, you can argue Paul is just saying with all of us, and I get every part of us, I guess he's saying that, but it seems to me that he's indicating that there are these different things that God would like to put into order. There was a comment that John Ortberg made where he asked if the tape was on, and I think they finally told him it wasn't, but it really was. But, he was asking Dallas Willard to explain this. If you've read The Renovation of the Heart, that's really what this comes out of. And I didn't like The Renovation of the Heart as much as I'm a fan of Dallas Willard. I thought it was too, what you just talked about, I thought it was too choppy. I'm not 4 pieces, I'm meat, right? But now I think I better understand what he was trying to say. I need the Dallas for Dummies that John Ortberg claims to be so I can understand him. But he was talking about how important it is for us to live a life where God really is in control of our life, in every aspect of our life, and that the way to the ordered life is that we've got to be more intentional about that surrender of the will for the sake of God. So. I think what I'd like for us to hear, and I don't know how you hear this, but my idea of what a lost soul was before and what it is now, it has given me a deeper conviction that I've got a lot of work yet to do within the church. Because if we don't have ordered lives for the world to see, what are we offering the world? Just one more activity on Sunday morning? So, how do we offer this experience without first experiencing it ourselves? Hey, any other thoughts from the Ortberg evening or day? Things that have stuck with you? I've got one more that I'd like to share. Any other thoughts? You're going to look. You can look. Tell you that one of the ones that really struck me as you continue to look, and I'll give you a couple more minutes to respond. I really liked his idea. I found it compelling, and it's been a challenge to me. If eternity, however that's going to be, is spending time in sinlessness, why would I not work toward that now? If that's really what I'm, not that we can be totally sinless, but I think I've had a sloppy existence in terms of excusing my behaviors way too easily. What if we're training into the eschaton? I like that idea. That we're training into the purposes of God forever. Because if we now entertain ourselves with sinful activities, and it might just be wrongful thoughts or whatever, but if we slide into those kind of habitual behaviors, why do we think all of a sudden we won't want to do that anymore? It's like there's going to be this transformative switch, and all of a sudden I'm not going to think the way I once thought. I don't know. I just found that really challenging. That there are certain things in my own life that I can't allow myself to think in ways that I have been too sloppy on in times past. If I'm training toward being with God forever, then why should I not want to live that way now? Did that impact anyone else?
I appreciate just that perspective on heaven in general. I think for many churches, or at least in my experience, heaven's been portrayed as like a cappella worship forever. I'm kind of like,
say that's not even consistent with Scripture.
That sounds like hell.
That's not
Wrong turn.
Yeah, I think it's been portrayed as this place where you just like sit and it's rigid and it's all gold, but there's no like enjoying being with God. And I think he really put it in a great way of just like you're spending the rest of eternity with your Creator. And I like that I think he said either that there in chapel that it's almost like the people that, not I haven't acknowledged you, but the people that will be in heaven in that sinless space, it's like who can stand that and who wants to bring them here on. I really appreciate that, just like perspective of heaven, rather than being this like pearly gates and gold streets. It's like it's not a gimmick. It's this like reconciled beauty with the Creator. So I appreciate it. I think he's so real too. I really appreciate it. Like I like that he's down to earth, and I like his whole aspect of training versus trying. One of the books he talks about trying softer, and I'm like, that's like life changing for women especially. I'm like, I need to try harder to be a better host. I need to try harder to be these 60 things. It's like try softer to be obedient and faithful, and I like his thoughts on train and try and busy versus hurry.
Well, that was a challenge, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's like, I think I confuse the two a lot, that just because I'm busy doesn't mean I have to be hurried.
Man, I took that as a personal challenge this last week because I've actually gone on vacation where I've been so hurried I haven't enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I just chose to practice the discipline of joy. And it made a real difference. I didn't let anything get on my nerves, although 2 or 3 things got close. But having the discipline, again, the well-ordered life is that you don't give importance to things that aren't important. That would be important if you were living in a self-centered life where everything reflects on you. But learning to live in the wider grace of God is a real joy. And what Ortberg was talking about with heaven is that it's a Dallas Willardism that's one of my favorite, is that heaven is open to all who can stand it. And there are going to be a lot of people who can't stand it.
Yeah, we can see some gossiping and self-promotion and greed. Those things are no longer options.
Yeah.
So do you really want that?
So will you have anything to say?
Desires, right.
Yeah, it's like, well, what do I do? If I
Follow
can't.
up on what she said, I had it written on here, but just slightly different in how he put it. which really impacted me. You said it's impacted me. Since that time, I've thought about this a lot. You said busy means a lot to do. Hurry is a disease of the soul. And I never had thought about hurry as being a disease. And since then, when I felt hurried, I think that's a disease. I am very busy, but and I never really thought about the difference in being busy and hurrying.
I think that's really been helpful to me. I'm probably busier than I've ever been, but I'm more at peace than I've ever been. And again, that the well-ordered life is, I tell you what causes hurry is putting self at the center of your busyness. Then all of a sudden you become so important that you push others out of the way and you get in a hurry. And practicing the discipline of patience, like getting in the longer line, that'll twist your mind. Give it a shot. Practice. And recognize that life is not what you once thought it was. Good. Thank you. Anything else before we move on? Okay.
Training, there was a quote, I don't know if he said it, but is there a quote, you don't think your way into a new way of living, you live your way into a new way of thinking.
Yes.
And that kind of resonated with what he said about, we're going to arrange our lives around those activities that enable me to do what I cannot do now.
Yeah, and I think that really digs into what Van Hoosen is going to talk about, whether you like his analogy or not. It's the idea of allowing Scripture to work as an illuminating force in our life, where rather than trying to force the script, we receive the script from the illumination, meaning that we're trying to receive life from an active God. That's the whole idea of the triune God. It means that there is an experiential element to the guidance of God, where, you have to be well informed or you can't understand it, so you're reading the Word of God, but then you're attentive to the ways of God in ways that I haven't previously been. And I just thought about that today. I've had a great day of, back from spring break, and I had the different students report in on the 40 different trips that were represented by various classes, and listening to those transformative experiences and just saying, why don't we live like that all the time? And sort of watching the stunned expressions of the students like, huh? Like, well, that was spring break mission trip. What do you mean live that way all the time? I said, well, what did you do that made your life meaningful? Well, I gave myself to the good of others. Might that be the well-ordered life? Might that be a part of what Jesus came to teach us? So let's live that way. And then I had probably 5 or 6 conversations with students outside of the classroom where they're just trying to figure out, what does it look like to order my life in the purposes of God? And I had them read an article over spring break. I actually read it. It shocked me. And just asked them to respond to it. And seeing their desire to understand and to seek, and not all the students, of course, some are just not interested, but the ones whose minds have been sparked by this whole idea that they have a role to play in what God is doing in the world. It's just fun to watch. All right, let me talk to you a little bit about effective communication, because this is now extra Van Hooser. So I'll post these slides. I don't have them posted yet. Get off my case. I had Dr. Allen came into my room just as I was ready to post them, and he's my boss, so I gave him appropriate attention. But I'll post these, so don't worry about writing this all down. But part of what we're talking about in terms of missional strategy is we've got to understand how to effectively communicate. So basically, when you have 2 people, this is a really basic understanding of communication theory. So if you took communication classes, get off my case. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but it's important to understand. Okay, she has a thought. Now, how do you think? You don't think in words. What do you think in?
Images, concepts.
Images, concepts, ideas. Okay? So what do you have to do? You have a thought to share, and you have a message that you'd like to communicate that comes out of that thought. Well, the first thing you have to do is encode it. And this is where you have verbal and nonverbal encoding of a message, right? And you understand that studies have shown, whatever you want them to say, but in terms of communicating, nonverbal communication overrides verbal communication. So that means the way in which you communicate is as important as the words you use. But recognize that the words you use are not your actual thought. You have encoded your thought into words. Right? We got it? All right, so what does this guy have to do? He decodes. All right. this is not unlike I have a younger brother who works in fiber optics, and he used to go around he worked for Sprint for a while, and he has his master's degree in fiber optics, and he would go all over the U.S. making lectures and presentations. He's my hero because he decided he didn't like that life, so he went back to driving his bucket truck and being a lineman. Took a half cut in pay, but he's done that for the last 20 years because he loves people. And so that's his life now, and he is the Garrison Keillor of phone linemen. I'm trying to get him to write a book. But he was explaining that when you hear a person's voice through fiber optics, you know that you're not hearing their voice. You know, you're hearing the encoding into light impulses that are later, and it's really amazingly sophisticated, that they have machines that will decode light impulses into sound that simulates the voice of the person that is speaking to you, but you're not hearing their voice. Right? You're hearing decoded light impulses, but done so precisely that it sounds as if you're hearing their voice. So this is what's happening all the time, and the question, of course, is the thought shared the message received? So how do you know this? Well, here is the big issue. In the middle of all this, there is noise. Now, what is noise? Well, in communication theory, noise is anything that interrupts communication. So is there noise in this room? That thing drives me crazy. They're promising me that within 2 years, these will no longer exist. That everything will be laptop and we'll plug into them and there won't be any of that. Right? Did you know there's no place on this campus where there is no noise? I begged them to build a quiet place for prayer in the next campus expansion, but it costs a lot of money and has little return. But I'd love for there to be a place of quiet on this campus. But of course, the physical noise is not the real issue. Noise is anything that interrupts the capacity of the individual to decode correctly what you've said. So I can tell. I had a student come in class this morning at 8 o'clock, and I called them. It was a little bit before 8, and I called them up to the front. I just said, "Hey, come here." Talked to them for a moment, and dismissed them. They were clearly distraught, and they informed me of a family situation they just found out about. There was no reason for them to be in class. Noise, right? They couldn't hear. I mean, they would have tried really hard. This is a good student. They would have tried really hard, but they had a family situation where there was so much pain that anything I would have said, they weren't there. Right? So if we're going to effectively communicate, perhaps the most important concept is feedback, so that we understand the noise that might be in their life, and especially when we start talking about something as clear as trying to convince someone to come to belief. We're trying to give them a whole different way of seeing their life. If we don't have some kind of feedback, and this is why I think for the most part, now look, I know good has been done through mass media, but when you start talking about missional strategies that don't involve personal presence, you are limiting yourself to words communicating what you expect them to communicate, when they may not even have the concept to decode what you're trying to say. And the story I was going to tell you about, a lot of you know Angad, who is a former Sikh who came here he came in spring semester last year. He didn't want to come to Lipscomb. He came because his life was soccer. He had lost his soccer scholarship, and he thought maybe he could play here. And he had another friend who was here. He didn't know Lipscomb was a Christian school. And he landed here, and in the first 2 or 3 weeks, he hated this school because everyone was talking to him about Jesus. And today, this is why one of the reasons why today was such a good day. He gave his testimony before a couple of my classes, and I wished for every one of you to be there because it was so powerful. And I'll share most of it with you in terms of missional strategies, how to effectively communicate the gospel, and how so many well-intentioned people were trying to tell him about Jesus. And he didn't even have the pieces in his. He comes from a background, if you don't know, Sikh is an expression of Hinduism. And he didn't even have, he said it today, he said, when people said Jesus, I did not see Jesus. I saw enemy of Hinduism and Christian people who had done wrong all through history. He said, I saw what I was brought up to believe was Jesus, and it wasn't Jesus at all. So here you have people with all the good intentions of the heart trying to communicate a message that he was incapable of hearing because of the noise of his own upbringing. And I can't tell you how many times we've tried evangelistic methods that don't communicate what we, and what we will sometimes say is, well, I've spoken the message. If they didn't hear it, it's their fault. No. If they didn't hear it, it's because, hey, if Jesus is the Christ, you let them hear that in its profound teaching and see if they'll walk away. But what I've experienced is that in most cases, people do not believe because what they have heard was not what the individual who was speaking was trying to communicate, partly because the communicator had no concern for the decoding process. So we'll talk about some scriptures that really clarify this. And what I want you to take into account, this is why I ask you to do a cultural evaluation. And I'm working with a couple of students online, so I'm talking to you now. We've had quite a bit of discussion via email of people who get stuck in the idea that a particular, well, I'll give you an example. This is not this class, so this is another class. But it was the idea that they were going to try to communicate effectively the gospel to a younger generation. And it worked. And what they were basically advocating is this is what would work for me, so it must work for them unless they don't want to hear it. And so then what happens is you say, well, those young people, they just don't want to believe. No, they just haven't heard the message. We found this out when we were working in Italy. This was really interesting. When we first were working at planting the church there, I was prepared with anti-Catholicism. That's what I was told. Then you've seen Lambert's Catholicism against itself. That's awful. Because basically you open up and say, Dear Catholic, sorry you're so dumb. You could not possibly believe what you believe and have any brains at all. Okay, that's my paraphrase, but it is so condescending. And then it starts going through all the papal errors of the history. It's like, they believe that? So here I am, primed and ready to go, and I can't find anyone interested in this conversation. And here's what was unique. What I found out was the first individuals that we were able to bring to faith were atheists. And the people that we had the most trouble bringing to faith were traditional Catholics. What we found out was they were the non-believers. The atheists were believers. They had just chosen to turn away from a traditional faith they saw no meaning in. So I would hear people say things like, I don't believe in God, but I know someone's behind creation. I mean, it's obvious that the universe is ordered by a divine being, but it's not God. Okay, if they say that, and I decode it, it's blowing my mind, because I'm hearing God. I know what God means, right? So I associate meaning in my mind, and that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, I believe in God, just not the one I've seen. So it's really important for us to understand what people hear and understand what they're thinking so that we can use language that is appropriate to their understanding. And so that's why, when you talk about Bible translation, should it be literal or dynamic? And the answer is yes. I mean, you want it to be true to the text, but you also want it to be understandable by the hearer. So how do we do that? And this is where Van Hooser is really good. If we don't act it out first, it's more about, what he's saying is theater is more about action than it is about words. Script is important, but only in the context of behavior. Okay, and I think that's very consistent with what John Ortberg was presenting in terms of kingdom living. If we're not living under the reign of God, why would people want to know what we know anyway? All right, so let's look at a few principles of effective communication. Break in on any of these you want to talk about. Okay, first of all, if you have identified a particular group of people, you've got to take into consideration the problem of plausibility. Okay, what plausibility means is people who are hearing you speak will have, we call it a plausibility structure. there are things which disallow certain things to even be possible, right? For instance, indifference by those who claim to believe. I've seen this as much as any particular manifestation when you're trying to tell people about Jesus. They know too many people who say they follow Jesus, but they don't. That's what Amgad said today. He said, the thing that is most painful to me now, and this is tough, but he says, I live on a campus of people who call themselves Christians who don't believe. He says, you have no idea how harmful it is for you to claim to follow Jesus when you're not really convinced that's what you should be doing. He said, the first people that talked to me on this campus, and you got to understand, Amgad's not trying to be accusatory. He's pleading with people. He's found this life in Jesus that is so wonderful that he can't imagine people not taking this seriously. And so he's saying, I plead with you, you can't be indifferent to your belief. You either have to live it all the way or don't claim that you're following Jesus when you don't do anything that he says to do. Public stereotypes and broken examples. How many failed televangelists do we need to talk about here? I mean, there are a lot of people that automatically associate. Now, hey, we do the same things with other religious groups, so let's not be too judgmental here. We find the worst possible example and say, oh, that's who those people are. Well, people do that with Christians as well. I saw an article the other day about a televangelist who's trying to raise $650 million for his own private jet. That rings authentic, doesn't it? Because it's bigger and faster than the one that he presently owns. And after all, the Lord wants what is best for his servants. Okay, now that hurts us, right? Okay. Then also this idea of rational thought versus the mystery of religious faith. That for some people, they feel like they're rational thinkers, and this is where I was working with my undergraduate class today on this. Faith can seem to be almost too technical at times, where it's like you have to work too hard to have it. But I don't think there's any level of thinking where the Christian faith cannot be defended. And we can't surrender to this thing that, well, I know this is not rational, I just believe in Jesus because I've experienced him in my heart. That's not going to convince anybody. And there are ways in which faith can be defended just as much as any kind of rational process. So, just because some people think that religion is one thing, rational thought is the other, don't let that one go. There are ways you can work through that. And if you're interested in that, I've got some really good resources for you. And then you have things like I trust science, not metaphysical conjecture. You hear that kind of self-pride. Okay, so how are you going to break through that when what they're basically saying is, I'm not going to believe in Jesus because it's not plausible to me? Well, the way that you bring in new plausibility possibilities is by showing them something they have not previously seen. So that leads into what Van Hooser is going to talk about a little bit later. Okay, then of course, historical identity of Christianity with sexism, racism, imperialism, wars. And we've got to own up to that. That's our history. But recognize that that's not Jesus. That's misrepresentation of Jesus. Now, this one's really tough. And maybe we've talked about this before. You are not who you are when you talk to another. You're the person that they think you are until you create a new image. So that's why you can go into situations with all the right motivation and have someone respond really badly towards you, and you take that personally. And get over yourself. It's not you. It looks to them like someone who's being condescending, or remember that, again, you're not who you are, you're who they think you are. So if in their mind, when they find out you're a Christian, when they decode that, it conjectures all kinds of ideas, it creates all kinds of ideas that are negative. Don't be offended by that. That's you showed me the book on Christian, right? Is that what you're reading, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay, so have you read it? Okay, so what is it? Basically, it's a survey of non-believers, 18 to 30, mostly in that age group?
There's different age brackets.
Yeah.
forward to, I think, 90 something, and probably 2002 for everybody's.
Okay, then they back them down, right?
Yeah.
But the statistics I've heard, I've read the book, but the statistics I've heard quoted most often are these 18 to 30-year-olds. When they're asked to identify what they believe a Christian to be, what's their number one answer?
Closed-minded.
Pardon?
Closed-minded.
Yeah, judgmental, homophobic, elitists. Okay. Is that you? Well, no. How could they think about me that way? Because that's what they've seen. So, there's some people who read that book whose response was, I can't believe he says this is not me, this is not fair. That's what the world sees. These people who are interviewed, that's what they've seen. Of course it's not you, but that's who they think you are. So does that impact how you're going to try to teach them? See, this is where our past evangelistic efforts have been so inefficient and unhelpful, because we've assumed everybody was waiting to hear the good word of the Lord. And all they needed was some corrective thinking, but recognize that, I think in the absence of an identifiable, behavioral, ordered life, it's really going to be hard to change a person's mind. I've told you the story of Max and how he came from an absolutely ruined, in fact, his life is the most tragic life I have yet to encounter. And then he finds this group of believers in a camp where everyone's living a totally different kind of life he's never seen before. And it shocks him into wanting to know why. And I talked to Max the other day, and he was reflecting on the fact, he said, mate, he says, didn't ever think I'd be a follower of Jesus. And I think back about how I used to use his name as if it were, just to be thrown away. And he says, here I am, the more I find out about him, the more I fall in love with him. And that would not have happened without presence. Seeing this new image. Okay, so we need to be sensitive to the views of the conversation partner, so it's important for us to listen first. That's the whole purpose of cultural evaluation. You're trying to figure out where they are so you can understand how they discern, decode what they see, what they want to hear, what they need. Of course, this is 1 Corinthians 9 all over the place. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the idea of Paul saying, I become what I need to become in order to win some.
I think it's interesting because of that concept that could never be me. How could they think that? Because they think that about me, I will hide in general. It's like we cover ourselves almost in that shame of like, your perception is wrong, so I'm not willing to prove it differently on your terms. I think that's like where the listen first comes in. If you sit there and say, that's not me, you don't understand me. You're playing on that stereotype of they're unwilling to listen, they're unwilling to hear, etc.
Well, in a sense, that's sort of look, any way you look at this, if we're going to embody Jesus in our world, it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult and it's going to be painful. I don't know what you think of Van Hooser's idea of martyrdom as a way of life, but I think he's right on target. Scares us, excuse the expression, to death. Okay, there was a little pun there. You can smile. But the whole idea of following Jesus is to lay your life down for the sake of others. I don't necessarily want to, my will is not formed to do that unless I have the Spirit of God transforming it into that. But until we have the experience that living for Jesus first is the only true way of life, and that becomes so vibrant in our life, all that we want to do is share it with others. I think that's what I heard from On God that was just so powerful to me today. Is he said, the last 8.5 months since I've been a follower of Jesus, I can't even compare it to what I formerly was. And he said, here's what's really funny. What I formerly was, I thought was really good. Because I'd lived a privileged life. My parents were wealthy. They sent me to America for an education. I was playing soccer. I had dreams of stardom. And I thought that was all wonderful. And now I can't even think why I wanted to live that way because I found something so much better. Sounds a lot like Philippians 3, doesn't it? That which I once pursued now looks like poop. That's the word, scubala, right? So he's talking about Paul saying, man, what I found is so much better. Okay. Until we're convinced that what we found in Jesus is so much better. That was on God's conversation today was, hey, wake up. Recognize the food that you're eating and how bountiful it is. And for those of you who've lived your whole life in a comfortable Christian home and never recognized how wonderful it is, wake up. This is a great, wonderful challenge. Okay, continuing these principles then. Attempts to evangelize in times past have been logocentric. Here, we're not talking about logos. We're talking about word as being the communication. So, words have been the primary means where truths have been the primary freight. And so we have put truths into words, hoping that the words themselves would take the freight into the mind of the hearer. What we haven't understood is that logocentricity is limited by the ability of the hearer to appropriately decode the words that they may not have previously heard. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? In other words, we have a certain set of words that we think are going to get people to believe, but they don't have the capacity to hear what we're trying to say because ideas are what we think in, not words. So, if we use a word like salvation, but a person doesn't understand what that means, or even, words that are really precious to us about the nature of Jesus, if they don't have a sense of context for that, then they're not going to understand it. So Christianity is more than a set of propositions. And this is where I think my teaching in the past, and I'm talking about years ago, when I used to basically teach 5 steps of salvation, you know how we did that. And it's not that, by the way, this is not to say that propositions are not involved. They are. But they have to be involved in the context of a larger story for them to make any sense. So I think I mentioned this before, but N.T. Wright says it's like connecting the dots. If your propositions, when you connect them, don't look like Jesus, they don't have any meaning. And the way that you connect the dots is by living the example of Jesus in such a way that people then understand why you believe what you do. So it's a way of life, and propositions then are embedded in a narrative. And by the way, what I think, I might have mentioned this 2 weeks ago, but what Van Hooser uses in terms of theater, I think it works really well with what I call narrative. It's the same thing. It's a story that we're living in. It's a drama that we're living in. So it's apprenticing in the school of life with Jesus. That's really interesting. One of the things that On God shared, and by the way, he said I could share what he shared, so I'm not saying something he wouldn't want to say. His best friend still lives in India, and he talks to him almost every day by Skype or whatever. And it's hard to do because, and there was a time when they quit communicating because On God had become a believer, and his friend just didn't know what to do with that. He just couldn't believe, they hadn't been home in a long time. And so he hasn't had an opportunity to share his deepest thoughts. But in a sense, what's happened in the last few months of On God's life, his parents, who he loves dearly, are going through a divorce, which doesn't happen in India. You just don't divorce. So it's a scandal. He said there's a time that would have ruined his life. And his friend is trying to figure out why On God is so joyful, even in the difficulty of the pain that he should be expressing. And On God says, don't misunderstand me. I'm suffering greatly. I love my parents deeply. I would do anything to keep this from happening. But my joy in Jesus is not going to be affected by the bad decisions of my parents. This guy's an 8-month-old baby. And he has a deeper understanding of Jesus than a lot of people I know who have journeyed in the church their entire lives. He's saying, what can take the joy of Jesus from me? And my friend now is going to a church in India because he's got to figure out what's happened to my mind. And he was pretty excited about it. He said, all I want is for everybody I know to know the Jesus that I found. This sounds sort of like Paul before Agrippa. All I want is for you to have what I have. Well, except for these chains. And that was comic relief, I think. Right? Yeah. Right? Wow. And so, anyway, it was just interesting to hear. And I kept shooting questions at On God, and I agree. Yeah, I know. They were leading, but it was good leading. I said, what's so different about your life now, On God? He goes, walking with Jesus. I was like, what kind of stupid question is that? It's walking with Jesus. And I'm learning so much from him every day, but I can't wait to wake up tomorrow. It's a new story. Okay, so Christianity is not going to be effectively communicated through words alone. Now, I hope you hear some Van Hooser in that. That's why the acting out of faith becomes so important. The medium, then, is the message. Do you want to argue this one? What's the medium? What's the medium? You. So you become the message because you're embodying the message that you're sharing, especially if you're trying to shape a way a person thinks about Christian, especially when he's not seen that before. And you know, the number one thing, without any hesitation, when I've heard On God tell his story, and I'm talking about his story just because I heard him talk about it today. He said, and I think I've mentioned this before, at summer celebration this last summer, we invited people over to the well to see what they did in their well house, and it was part of the summer celebration. And I remember this because I went home and journaled about it. It was so powerful to me. I was standing next to On God, and he had not yet become a believer. I mean, a Christian. But he had sort of told his story about how the well house had given him an opportunity to explore faith. You know what drew him to the well house? It was really interesting. He said, I just couldn't imagine an entity that existed for the sake of helping people you don't know. He said, that's just foreign to my mind. Why would you sell coffee, make money, and give it away to people you don't know? He said, I just thought that was sort of silly, but it rang true. That's the echoes of the voice. You hear it? That there was something that resonated with his heart that intrigued him. So he starts hanging around. Of course, Rob Touchton was his teacher, and that he had for the first time hearing the story of the church, which I'm really thankful that he had Rob. But he's hearing this story, and he's trying to make sense of it. And he sees these people living this out. And then what happened is he got crossways with immigration, lost his student visa, and he had some people who drove him down to the Texas border, people he didn't know, students he didn't know, drove him all the way down to cross the border. There's a loophole that is legal, that if he could re-enter, it would renew his student visa, and the difficulty that he had with immigration would be removed. So he has these people who journey with him for 2 days down and back. And what he told me when I was standing there next to him, and he whispered over to me as after he had made his presentation, where he said, you know, this environment introduced me to the ways of Jesus in ways the church never could. I said, well, On God, where are you right now? He said, the Jesus that I once pushed away and offended me, he said, he's become so compelling. He said, this is blowing my mind, but I think I have to become his follower. So the medium in that case were people living out the ways of Jesus. That's what he said today. I said, On God, if you had to identify one thing, I'm only going to give you one thing, what made the difference in your life? He said, people living the ways of Jesus. He said it that quick. So, you know, the power of the idea of being on the stage, living the ways of Jesus, is what's going to be, I think that's going to be the transformative experience that through which the Spirit of God communicates with others. So, let me ask you this before we take our break. If someone followed you around for a week, and here you can't count your graduate Bible class, and you can't count church. Now, I don't want to be quoted for that. Okay? Church doesn't count. That would be a bad tweet, because that's too easy. But if someone followed you around and watched how you spent your time and how you spent your money and how you spoke of others and who you associated with, what would they perceive your religion to be? Is that a fair question? And to make it even worse, if they could know what you're thinking when no one else knows. You go, don't go there, don't go there. Well, is there a better way for us to live our lives so that we might become effective communicators of the message to which we want to invite others? Okay, response, questions, thoughts.
When you said right there, I know we didn't really hash out last week's lecture, but when you were talking about, when you daydream, where do your thoughts go? What do you think of the, personal? So is it, I get to watch that football game, I get to go fishing, I'm going shopping, I can't wait. Or do we focus our thoughts towards Him? And that lowered my self-esteem a little bit. You think you're something, but then I hear you say that in that lecture, kind of echoing what you just said, and it's just like, man, I got to get it together a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the most difficult area to discipline is where our minds go when we don't have to think about anything in particular. Which in class I'll normally say, that's where some of you are right now. Come back. Where do our minds go for entertainment? And you think about, if they don't go to the throne of God, then we're expecting too little. Because that's where we're going to live forever. Now, it may be that we have some really bad images like Keela was talking about earlier. Really? Just as I am for 2 million years? No, thank you. Right? I've already done that at least twice. But if it's a sense of being with the one that you were created to be with from the beginning, and that He's given you an opportunity to understand the precious nature of that, of being a part of the triune God, being in His presence. My question is, how do we use our creative imagination in helping our children see that a guy inside of a Donald Duck suit may be cool, but how much better is it to imagine what it would be like to be in the presence of God? We just haven't done that well. I'm not going to put that on you. I haven't done that well. We have all this creativity and all this possibility to create and think, and we've turned church into a sort of boring experience. We got to do better.
I have a question about him. What has his church experience been like, or does he have one? You just said that what brought him to Christ was the actions of people taking him, down, and why would someone want to do something for a total stranger? So here's a person that, I don't know how churched he is, but does he have any kind of a church relationship? Or
the well, he's really involved with the well house.
Because conventional wisdom would say that, the way you get people the way you convert them is you get them in the pew, you get them in church.
Yeah.
Here's a situation where we don't have any idea what he even has gone to church. Now you're telling me he did, but
that's
to be converted without much of a church experience.
Well, what they're talking about in terms of, this is where we got to rethink a little bit too. This is hard.
Isn't some of that all him being at this university though and sitting through that class you talked about?
Yeah, it's part of it too. But
what is church?
Yeah, what is church? That's the big question.
Right.
Where is church?
That was
Who is
my
church?
point.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Not to downplay.
No, I'm struggling with this
it's
too.
Interesting to me that when he gives his testimony, it is all about actions and none about.
I think the Well House was his community.
It was.
That was his church.
It was without a doubt.
It's a
but
non-traditional location, but it is a church.
And he's not the only story. I can tell you 5 or 6 stories. Keela knows some of them of people who I can't imagine ever being reached in conventional church. That the Well House has been an entry point. Rob Touchton calls it. I want him to come in and talk to you, but he calls it that third space. It's not really home. It's not really church. It's a safe place for people to find a new understanding. And this is part of what Alan Burris was struggling with trying to communicate. And Steve and I have been talking about this. Where does the church play into the social concerns of trying to help the poor? And what Alan's trying to do is to give them a whole new way of seeing church, because all of them have been in some way, shape, or form been pushed away by clean people in nice clothes going to a building nicer than anything they have in their experience. And frankly, they wouldn't feel comfortable there. Well, how do you bring them into the reign of God? And so part of that is really tough in terms of us rethinking what church is.
kingdom conspiracy. She says that good works done for the common good but not related to Christ as Savior are not kingdom works.
Yeah, I agree.
And so at what point does, are we saying, okay, the well is a church, and we get to think about congregation? Is it a congregation, or are we thinking, is it part of the church universal, or is it individual Christians acting, or where is the kingdom involved? And if the kingdom is not just what Dallas Willard says, that the realm over which God has control or influence, but we define it differently. That people going to mission trips last week to build houses,
Yeah.
and we said that's kingdom work. Well, as McKnight views it, it's not.
Unless it's done, overtly in the name of Jesus. In other words,
Does that, as he would say, does that baptize it now so that it becomes a spiritual?
No, but I mean the idea is that, and what one of the best examples of this I really like is some of you are familiar with the Baja expansion of the church. And what they do down there is they'll go down and build church buildings and build houses, but they're also introducing them to Christian faith communities as a part of that work. They're not insisting on it, but they're saying, this is a community of people who care about you. And they have a guy, I love this idea, he's working full time. This guy's an incredible guy. He was making bukus, I'm talking millions of dollars, as a architect using recycled goods to build these fancy homes on the sides of mountains in Malibu. And he was using retreaded tires and all sorts of creative things. And he just got bored with it. So now he's working with this ministry in Ensenada, Mexico, teaching sustainable farming to villagers wherever the churches are planted. He's teaching them how to use the desert and collect rainwater from their roofs and all this stuff. But it's not just, this is how to make food. This is how communities of faith work. We're concerned about your physical well-being. And so come be a part of this faith community. I mean, you have people saying, well, no, you can't mix those together. And so, I mean, just exploring that idea. How do we bring this into kingdom work by making... Because if you give people food, but you're not giving them life...
Well, I don't know how much it matters, what we call it, except as his point has been that there has been a move away from church to socially good for the common good.
Yeah.
And it has separated itself from the message of Christ as the Redeemer and the Savior.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem.
It is.
And but when Christ is involved, then that is the motivation, the message behind all that we're doing, whatever it is we do.
Rob makes that very clear too. If you've ever sat through a service at Well House, he makes it very clear. Like yesterday, he ended with the chapter, John 4, about the woman at the well, and talked about, again, where the name came from and that it was Jesus that promised that living water.
So they have
he wraps it up. It's a church.
Yeah, they break bread.
I don't know.
Yeah, on a regular basis.
Yeah, they call it.
I know the coffee
and
shop.
they have communion, and so
Really?
it's,
Yeah.
So what do they call it? The church? The
Well
well church?
House
They call it the Well
Church.
House. The Well House
Well
Church.
House.
Is that like, do they do that just out of curiosity, like during normal business hours?
They do it at 10:45 on Sunday mornings.
But they're not open yet? Or?
No,
there's
it's
people,
open.
There are people walking in.
No,
buying
I've been there, and
while
it's-
church is going on.
It's really interesting. I mean, it would be
You'll see
distracting.
a look on their face when they come in, like.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to
Well, and what they say, and it's
then they
very-
kind of,
It's very natural. They say, if you want to stay, you're welcome to stay. But if this is, we got a room up in the top over there, you can go to hell. I mean, you can go. They don't say that. They say you can stay if you want to. And it's interesting to me how many sort of stay and sort of listen.
Yeah, kind of listen in the back. They may stand a little bit in the back,
Yeah.
but they listen.
And the one that's really shocking to me is the one out of Brentwood, because I didn't think it'd work out there and all that glass and new building and everything. But it's
They have worship out
That's,
there.
Yeah.
The Brentwood one has 10:45 a.m. worship. The one on Granny White has a 5 p.m.
5 p.m. Yeah.
Well, but it's over that. I might show up.
Yeah, you should try one out.
Yeah, you don't want to go get a cup of coffee when they're worshiping.
No, I won't.
That would mess up your
I
mojo.
won't be there when they're working.
You don't want to mix the two? All right, take a break. 10 minutes. Be back in 10 and we'll finish up today. Thank you.